All right, gentlemen, here we go.
What up, Mike? Toronto. VK on the beat. Check. I'm in Toronto where you wanna get a city love. I'm from Toronto where you wanna get a city love. I'm in Toronto like we wanna get a city love. My city love me back for my city love.
Welcome to episode 1430 of Toronto Mic'd. Proudly brought to you by Great Lakes Brewery, a fiercely independent craft brewery who believes in supporting communities, good times, and brewing amazing beer. Order online for free local home delivery in the GTA. Palma Pasta. Enjoy the taste of fresh, homemade Italian pasta and entrees from Palma Pasta in Mississauga and Oakville. RecycleMyElectronics.ca. Committing to our planet's future means properly recycling our electronics of the past. The Advantaged Investor Podcast from Raymond James Canada. Valuable perspective for Canadian investors who want to remain knowledgeable, informed, and focused on long-term success. And Ridley Funeral Home. Pillars of the community since 1921. Today, joining me to discuss CJCL's launch of all sports radio, The Fan, way back in 1992, is Allan Davis, Nelson Millman, Scott Metcalfe, Tim Haffey, and Dan Shulman. Welcome, everybody.
Hello, Mike.
Hello, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
That's more sponsors than we had when we launched the station.
True.
Well, I'm hoping, Nelson, we're going to talk about the launch of the station. I'm going to try to get out of the way. I want to hear about the lay of the land when CJCL, before it went all sports, the decision to go all sports. I want to hear about those early days, the legacy of the station. The big day, of course, was in 1992, September. I want to hear from all of you. I will get out of your way, and then later I'll come in with some questions from FOTMs. But let's just go around the horn here. So, Allan Davis, you're making your Toronto Mike debut.
This is fantastic. It's great, as I said, to see all these people here. And the people here, including Tim, are the ones who were there at the beginning in September of 1992. And our reason for launching all sports was Steve Simmons wrote an article some months ago, and he used the word desperation in it about, maybe why we ended up where we did. And I thought that was somewhat appropriate, maybe a little aggressive, but appropriate at the same time. We had a frequency that was struggling. We had a number of really good assets in the Blue Jays and the Maple Leafs, but maybe not a music format that could complement it all. And we decided that it was time that we took that sports audience that we had and maybe see if we could migrate to longer hours and convert that. And that's what we did. And, a technical term, I'm sure Nelson would be able to back this up. When you look at the format itself, all sports versus what we were doing back then, in our industry, in all industries, there's a power ratio that you look at, and the power ratio maybe that we had for what we were doing with Music of Your Life wasn't necessarily converting to revenue. Whereas when you looked at the model of all sports, which was happening at that time in New York and Dallas and I think Philadelphia at that time with WIP, they were able to demonstrate that there was a power ratio where you were able to generate a lot of revenue with the audience that a sports format would deliver. So what a desperation, maybe that's why this happened. Does that sound right, you guys?
Nope.
Okay, wait, listen. And that was perfect. That's like the teaser.
Thanks for coming out.
I was going to say, that's the teaser. That's it in a nutshell. Now we're going to pull out those threads and get a little more detail. But I want to say hello as we just go around the table here. Nelson Millman making his Toronto Mike return. You are an FOTM. How the hell are you doing, Nelson?
You know what? I'm fine. All is good. I'm gainfully unemployed with no marketable skills. I'm sort
Nothing
of playing
changes.
golf as Allan once said, radio is a business for C students, and most of us are underqualified. So I'm fine. I'm in warmer climes than where you clowns are.
Where are you? And where are you, Alan? Before we get to Nelson again, where are you,
Buffalo.
Alan? But you're in where? Buffalo.
In Buffalo.
Okay, so you got the snow too. Okay, but Nelson, no snow where you are. Where are you? Florida.
Yeah, Bonita Springs, which is about halfway between Naples and Fort Myers. A lovely, lovely little burg.
When do you come home?
End of March.
Okay.
So we come down. We come down for the entire winter.
Okay, Nelson. Thanks
Because
for coming back. Go ahead.
No, I had nothing.
Okay, well, let me get the intros out of the way, and then you guys are just going to tell me the story. Scott Metcalfe, you've been here a few times, Scott, because you were here recently for the 30th anniversary of 680 News, and you gave me a few gifts. I want to say hello to you. I want to hear how you're doing, and I want to thank you because you sent over a package knowing you couldn't be here in person, and it is like, what are these called? These are the microphone flashes. This is a Fan 1430 flash. Is there a story around this? I love it, and then tell me how you're doing.
They're named after you. They're mic flashes.
Hey.
But if you get the small one over there on your right, okay, and compare it to the other one. So you see, the smaller one was the one that everybody was using back in the late 80s, early 90s. When we went to the Fan 1430, I think Alan was probably involved in this discussion, and we might have gotten the idea from the Fan in New York. We were looking around for mic flashes because that's a big part of the marketing early on, right? You want to get that mic flash in all the Leaf dressing room, Jay's dressing room, like you just want to get that imagery out there. So we decided to go with that big one. And Tim may remember this. It might even be Tim's story that when we first started using it, I remember one of the reporters came back and said, "Oh, the TV guys are really mad at us." And I said, "Why are the TV guys mad?" He said that because the mic flash is so big that when we hold it up, it can kind of get in the way. And one of the camera guys, I think it was CFTO, said, "That thing's so big you could land a 747 on it."
Well, let's
And then we ordered bigger ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, we eventually had giant Fan 590 ones that you could land that airplane on.
That voice you hear belongs to Tim Haffey, who I think I've heard give how many 2020 sports updates through the years?
Probably 10, 20,000.
Okay. And Tim sounds so good because Tim is sitting beside me in the TMDS studio. Tim, you're making your Toronto Mike debut. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm pleased to be joined by all my former supervisors. And for a short time, Dan Shulman was a peer for a couple of years there. But I think we bring unique perspectives. I'd be really interested to hear what Alan and Scott and Nelson have to say in terms of how the whole sports radio came together, and which, from my perspective, was actually March of 1992. But my perspective is much different because I came in, and I've researched this, and the date had to be Friday, March 13th. I know it was a Friday. And I came in, Alan had invited me in. I'd had an interview with Alan maybe 6 months earlier. Alan and I had been talking. I can tell that story later, but I'll just skip ahead here. But I came in March of 13th, 1992, mid-afternoon, I guess, late afternoon. And I thought I was coming in for a meeting. And I met Scott Metcalfe for the first time and a few others, including Dan, who was in the newsroom prepping his first show. And then suddenly I discovered I was being thrown on the air at midnight. So I had to, readjust my entire focus. But luckily I had about 6 hours to prepare and just sort of fake my way through that first overnight shift.
I'm glad.
Well, that's a typical Allan hire, and he just hired people and put them on the air and hope for the best.
That was the plan.
One more introduction before I get the heck out of the way. Dan Shulman has joined us, making his Toronto Mike debut. Dan, how are you doing?
Not my Toronto Mike debut.
Oh, making your return. Did I say debut?
Obviously, I left one hell of an impression on you the first time.
Actually,
You didn't
Dan,
get the pasta thing, did you?
I'll say this to you, Dan. I put together this mockumentary on Joe Carter's walk-off in '93, and I have you on this mockumentary with the greatest story I've ever heard, I think, is remind us where you were when Joe Carter touched them all.
In a freight elevator at the Sky Dome, as it was known then. I was doing the pre and post game shows at the time, so my job was to get up to the hotel lobby at the ballpark and do the post game shows. So they went to the bottom of the ninth, and I think it was 6-5 Phillies. So I started making my way up, and there was this big freight elevator, the kind with the big metal door that comes down and the big wooden doors that come in and the big latch and whatever. And it just kind of didn't work for a little while, and I was in there for a minute or two, and then it felt like an earthquake. And that's when Joe Carter hit the home run. So, the world being what it was then, I didn't see it till probably the next morning on a sportscast somewhere. So I had a pretty good idea they had won the World Series. That was the only positive outcome I could think of when I felt what I felt in that elevator. But I missed it.
It's a great story, though, and glad you're back. And how you doing? You doing all right? You're a busy man.
I'm a busy man, but I'm doing great. Thank you. We're all a little bit older. I don't know if any of us is any wiser than we were back then, but I'm a big fan of, common shared experiences and memories and nostalgia. And this group certainly fits the bill. I mean, I wasn't in management like Allan and Scott and Nelson were. I was more like Tim. I mean, when I showed up, I was 24 years old. I was so young that Allan told me when certain newspaper writers would call to find out about my background, and they would say, "How old are you?" Allan would say, "Just don't tell them. Why would you tell them how old you are? It's none of their business." And Scott was really my entree into the station, which I'm sure he remembers well. I did sportscasts at the beginning. I was so good on my first weekend, I got pulled off the air before my second weekend, and I had to go back to Metcalfe University for a few more months and get some more great tutelage from Scott. And I was working up in Barrie. I would come down every Friday afternoon, and Scott and I would listen to tapes, and eventually they put me back on the air to do sportscast. And then my life really changed. I don't want to jump ahead too far, but I guess this would be March of '92. We kind of went to a hybrid, right? Like 5 p.m. to midnight. And I think that was
March 16th.
March 16th of '92.
Yes.
Which was a Saturday.
Well, I remember the date as being March 16th. I don't know what actual
It's
date
a Monday.
It could have been a Saturday.
Okay, I'll just jump in here for a sec. I remember it was a Friday because I was relieved on the Saturday morning by Fred Locking, and it was definitely a Saturday morning. Okay. So we launched that hybrid format, as far as I can tell, Friday, March 13th.
Okay.
And
you might be right. I thought it was a Saturday, but let me back up. Say whatever day it was, 3 days before, I'm sitting in that little makeshift office with that old couch and the fridge and the sink, and I'm sitting with Todd Macklin.
The smoking room.
Yeah, in the smoking room, right. And Allan Davis walked into the room and looked at me and Todd, and he said, "Oh, by the way, you guys are doing a talk show on," maybe it was Friday, because Saturday we would have had the Leafs, so it must have been Friday. You guys, Bob's doing 5 to 8, and you're doing 8 to midnight, and go get them," and walked out. And Todd and I immediately burst into tears and had no idea what to do. So I had just turned 25. Todd would have been 24, and God bless Allan, the king of sink or swim. He walked into the office and said, "Go get them, boys." And so we did that for about 6 months, right? March to September, until we went 24 sports. But it was a very exciting, fun time.
So Dan, you're talking about your first evening hosting show there?
Yes. The reason I thought it was a Saturday is, and I will defer to everybody else's memory on this show, and I mean that sincerely, but it's the music we played. Bob played like Saturday in the Park by Chicago or something from 5 to 8, and then I came on at 8 and we played his song, and then we like used a blow it up sound effect. And then we played Elton John's Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. So that's why I thought it was a Saturday. Maybe the Leafs were on the West Coast or something. I might be totally wrong, but it was definitely March.
I've got very vivid memories of that day because it was so kind of life-changing for me at the time. But I like I said, I remember coming in, and Allan and I had talked back in the fall when the Blue Jays were playing the Minnesota Twins in the ALCS, and I'd been working for BN at the time, running all over Toronto, covering sports. And I thought, CJCL seemed to be the lead sports station in Toronto, and I thought maybe I can squeeze in there and do sports updates or reporting or something. And the first name I latched on to was Allan's, because Allan had the title of network sports director. And then Allan, you probably don't remember this, but you put me off at first. You said, Tim, we're right in the middle of this baseball series, and the Twins and the Jays, and Jays theoretically could have gone all the way that year. So you told me, give me a call when it's all over. So I dutifully did when the Jays got knocked out by the Twins in that series. And then I came in and we had a really good interview, more of a discussion. We talked for about an hour, I think, all over the map. And then what you told me was, Tim, there's things happening here. They're kind of hush-hush. I can't really say, but we'll keep in touch. And we left it at that. And then I think I might have called you one more time between then and March, just to touch base. And then I came home one day, I picked up the Toronto Sun, and it said CJCL Going Sports Radio. And I thought I better call Al. So I went to my answering machine. You'd already called me and left a message, and it basically said, get in here. So I came in for a meeting, I think you said. And then I came in for that meeting. And this I remember vividly. I walked into that newsroom for the first time from the hall, looked to my left. The first two people I saw were Barb DiGiulio and Natalie Peugeot, which is a nice first impression of the station. Then I looked further to my left, and Scott Metcalfe just came out of his door, so processed another face. And then I looked straight ahead, and Dan, I did actually know you by sight because I'd seen you out in the field. And so I recognized Dan, and then Todd Macklin was with you, and Scott Ferguson was running around frantic. I think he was probably just about to go on the air. And I that's visually what I all took in. And then I guess at some point I talked to Scott, and then Scott informed me, by the way, you're starting at midnight.
Wow. Okay.
If only there was a way to figure out a date from the past and what day it might be. It was a Monday.
Right.
What I recall, yeah.
Okay.
What I recall,
Yeah.
Is what Dan recalls as well, and what Tim is recalling. The thing that I remember is Scott Metcalfe brought a tape of Dan Shulman to me after you had already been doing some sportscasts for him.
Yeah.
And it was a cassette he brought up, and he says to me, "This is hockey. You need to listen to this guy. I think he could be really good." And so I recall listening to that tape. And then on a Saturday, you were doing news. I think it was a Saturday that I came in, and you know how you walk through the newsroom, Scott's office was kind of off to the left, and you were way back at the back there. And I walked back and sat down and talked with you. And I remember having the conversation about you could do hockey already. I listened, I said, and for whatever reason, I said, if Tom Cheek or Jerry Howarth were to get hurt, we don't have anybody that could really back up to do baseball. I said, you should really think about doing baseball. You should just think about it. That's all I said, not knowing what would happen, but knowing that you had this great talent. So I kind of parked that in my brain. And then Scott, by the way, Nelson and I talked virtually every day. It didn't matter where he was, my best friend in the world. And we talked every day about this format long before it ever was launched. You do need to know that, Mike, that this man and I talk sports and radio literally every day. That's why he won't call me anymore. That's why he's in Florida. He does not want to be around me.
I love his wife though.
Yeah. But we talked about Dan and we talked about this format. And I remember the second conversation I had with Dan was just before he went on the air that night. I did say to him, I know this because it was in the hall. I said, you don't know it, but tonight your life is going to change. You will not be the same after this. It just won't. Because I knew that once people heard Dan Shulman doing a talk show, that things were going to change rapidly. We already had Bob in place, and by placing Dan next to it, I had a high level of confidence, as did Nelson, that this format was going to work. We didn't know how long it was going to take. We didn't know any of those things, but we did know we had two very, very, very good talents that we could build around. And I remember
think Dan really stood out to me. We did the Molson Indy race. Allan was one of the, I think we made one of the first to put a car race on the radio when the Molson Indy came to town. And Dan's only job was to get tape from the pit and bring it back to the trailer that we were broadcasting from.
Yeah.
Eric Thomas, was that the year that I think Sneva, our friend Tom Sneva, came in and spent about $1 million in room service. But Dan would, the whole race is running back and forth and back and forth. He'd talk to a driver, he'd talk to somebody in the pits, and then come tearing back into the trailer. Back out he'd go. And I'm sure, by the end of it, he must have lost about 20 pounds, but that was what it was going to take for talents like Dan Shulman to get to the position that he's achieved.
Well, and Mike, the funny thing is, like before Allan, and I do remember Allan saying that to me in the hallway, I had never done a talk show. So the hockey Allan and Scott, I guess you're talking about, must have been the Barrie Colts. I was doing Colts up in Barrie. Like I came from CKBB in Barrie. That's the only hockey I had done.
Then it could have been, but Scott, do you remember? Because it was, you also, did you not, you did basketball at
Or
University
maybe
of
at
Western
Western.
Ontario.
Might have been some Western
There was
stuff.
that
So,
too.
but all I wanted to do was work at a Toronto radio station, preferably in sports, so I could live in Toronto. I was from Toronto, and I was up in Barrie, and Barrie was great. I mean, just a crash course in learning stuff, because as you guys know, I have no background, no education whatsoever. I'm a math geek. So, but I was just minding my own business, doing sportscasts and having a great time, an absolutely great time. I had no inkling we were going sports 5 to midnight, and no inkling that I was going to do a talk show until the second Allan said to me, "Go get him, Tiger."
Scott, I want to hear you for a moment. I have a couple of clips thanks to you.
Yeah.
Maybe you can set them up. There's the football clip from the University of Western Ontario, and then there's a rehearsal for a talk show.
Yeah, you can. So because we're on the, let's go in chronological order. Let's do the football University of Western Ontario play-by-play. So, and this is, I always love this when people, managers say, I discovered that guy or whatever. For me, the great fortune that I had was that Dan discovered us. He came to us, and he had the tapes, and he had the passion, and he had the drive. And this was play the University of Western Ontario football, because when I heard that, I thought, this guy's got something special.
Trying to get a drive going. 2nd and 7. Backstand a block. Samway's quick pass, and he has belted just as he let the ball go by middle linebacker Dan Wicklum as the Griffins continue to blitz and blitz effectively.
Wow, great penetration there by Wicklum. He was able to ground Samways, hit him in a very susceptible spot right in the ribs. It's a good thing to see that Samways is walking off okay. That's a quarterback's nightmare, is when you're doing that follow-through, you leave your whole midsection susceptible to a hard hit like that. Luckily, Samways is going to walk off okay. McAreedy now into punt.
Daryl Skuse will play, but he won't punt return in the second half. It's Brian Campbell joined by Dan Tucker back deep for the Griffins.
They're coming after it.
Here they come. McAreedy gets it off. It's probably his best kick of the game. Down to Campbell at the 31 of Guelph, up to the 35, and quickly downfield for the Mustangs to bring him down at the 32. Can't get the number on him just yet. Is number 40, Matt Shirot.
I'll tell you one thing, Dan. I don't know if you noticed it there, but McAreedy is still taking a lot of time to kick the ball. He seems almost greedy for that high average to maintain in his favor. I don't think Larry Haler cares about that average. I think he just wants some kind of a kick downfield. And the Mustangs picked up the Griffins rushing well there. If they wouldn't have, I'll tell you 100% that kick would have been blocked.
Well, McAreedy with a very poor first half gets his best kick of the game off in the second half. Walters in at quarterback. Al Ananek split right. Brian Campbell split left. Handoff. Daryl Skuse. Gain of about 3, and he's wrapped up by the linebackers at about the 38.
Wow.
So there you go.
Sound like me.
I know.
You
Well,
had
you know what?
you had just gone through puberty at that
I
point.
guess. So let me say a couple of things. The other voice is my friend Joe Millstone, who I think is
Very
much
good.
better than I am on
He's
that
good.
tape, actually.
He was
He
pretty
missed his
good.
calling, I guess. I have not heard that since the day when obviously I handed a cassette to Scott in 1991 or something like that. Those are great memories. The funny thing, I don't think that sounds like me. It almost sounds like it's sped up a little bit or something. And I don't know if it is or it isn't. And not to change the topic here at all, but it kind of sounds like my son. Actually, more than it sounds like me.
On that note, Dan, I want to say congratulations to your son, Ben, and he's the new voice of Toronto Blue Jays on the radio. That's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, he's very excited. I'm very excited. And I don't mean this is a memory show. So let's get back to 1991. But the first thing I thought when I heard that is it sounds more like him than it does me. But Western was great. I'll tell you, I'll tell this story super fast. I went to Western. I wanted to write for the Gazette, and there were like 100 people in line. I went the first day of Frosh Week, and like 100 people in line. So I started walking back to my dorm, and there was a door that just said Radio Western. So I knocked on the door, and somebody said, "Come in." I said, "Is this the campus radio station?" They said, "Yes." I said, "Do you do sports?" They said, "Yes." I said, "Do you need volunteers?" They said, "Yes." So Allan is right. In the hallway that day, that was a life-changing day. But go back to Western. I never intended to do any of this, and I just got lucky. And for 3 or 4 years, I did football games, basketball games, a little hockey, and I did a talk show called From the Cheap Seats, which I think still might exist there, I believe. And it worked out okay.
And
it
Dan,
worked
I
out
recorded
okay.
that.
Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, Mike. Yeah, I recorded that off a cassette just like 2 weeks ago, and I sent it to Mike. So that cassette is the oxide's probably wearing a little thin on that.
Oh, okay. That would explain it.
Scott, set up this this other clip I have of young Dan Shulman. It's relevant to this part of the convo.
Yeah, this is a talk show rehearsal that has never been heard anywhere but probably Dan and me and Todd Macklin and maybe Allan and Nelson. Because
we rehearsed.
Yeah, we did. We did. And what we did was, I thought it was wise, and so I don't know whose idea it was, but obviously
It would have been yours.
No. Anyway,
Any rehearsal, Scott, was always, maybe we should practice a little bit. And I remember going, I don't think we got time, Scott. 6 o'clock's coming. It's going to be 6 o'clock in an hour.
If it was a good decision, it wasn't Allan or.
But what we decided to do was, let's do, I think, a couple of hours. And we played commercials and we did intros and we did extras just to have the rhythm of what it was like to do a talk show. Because otherwise, if you're just stepping in there, you're not sure, like, do we break or what's going on? So we did this rehearsal, and it's just Dan and Todd goofing around. They're having some fun, and it's not serious at all, but it gave them the idea of the rhythm. So here's Dan and Todd Macklin in a rehearsal that has never been heard by most people before.
21 minutes after the hour here at Sports Radio CJCL 1430. Dan Shulman with you until midnight tonight. Midnight tonight, another 3.5 hours of all the.
I'm happy about it too.
Plenty coming up in the next hour. We will have Julius Erving, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Magic Johnson in the studio for a little roundtable next hour. But just the highlight of the show, down to Florida we go to talk to Todd Macklin, the copy boy with the Boston Globe. Looking forward to another choke-filled season by the Red Sox. And Todd, are we going to get a race from you guys this year or what?
As usual, we'll challenge the Blue Jays. We'll probably win the division because it is every second year, that we do.
So you're due
win the division. Yeah. Then we'll probably we'll either get blown out in the championship series, or if we do manage to squeak by there by some fluke of nature, we'll get into the World Series. Probably have the champagne already out in the clubhouse, and of course, blow it.
So that was it.
Wow. Well, that's an exclusive, right? No one else has that. This is a very big.
I don't think so.
But that's great. Sports radio is having great guests, and Dan is clearly getting great guests that show.
I recall.
No wonder we blew the budget.
No, I recall, Scott. Here, listen to this. I recall that interaction. It's great that you got that. That's fantastic. We were in a rush the whole time. It was frenetic pace because the decision to do this wasn't one that was made a year or two in advance. It was actually made months in advance, and it was a result of, let's try to continue to expand on the Toronto Blue Jays broadcast, which was very successful, obviously, because the team was doing so well. So we added hours of programming, and we eventually were able to succeed in getting primetime sports on the air. And our reason for doing that was to continue to push that envelope a little further. There was a demand for Toronto Blue Jays programming. There wasn't a demand for the music of your life or whatever the music format was, but there certainly was for the talk and sports format. So we continued to push that, and we were eventually able to get our good friend here, Nelson Millman, who was managing CJBK in London at that time. And we had to have London as an affiliate because Labatt's were backing our programming, and we needed their home office to be able to hear it. And so Nelson, smart as he was, played coy the whole way along and said, okay, well, I'll add it to the station. And Paul Williams and I did tell him, well, we really need you. You're the last one. Everybody else is going, knowing full well when we get in the car, he was the first one. No one else had done anything at that point. But we knew that we were going to be able to legislate the rest of the telemedia stations to take it. But you got to understand,
when I was running CJBK and Allan came hat in hand on his knees begging for us to take some of the programming, the deal we cut was one that had never been cut with these guys before. So we were, every homestand, we brought in 20 contest winners. We got them into the Sky Dome, now something else. Long before the gates opened, they got to watch batting practice, and they would get to meet one of the players. And that was kind of the negotiation that went on in order for us to become the first station to carry. But the Blue Jays network was very strong at that point. Allan had done a great job, because you got to remember, there was the radio station, and then there was the network, and the network handled all of the syndicated programming, handled the Leafs, handled the Jays, the starting of primetime sports, and a number of other features that used to get syndicated. So really, the station and the network were two different items. When the decision was made to go sports, Allan was clearly going to be the program director. There was nobody else who was ever going to be able to do it as well as he was going to be able to. And I came in and took over the network. And so that's how that came about. And Primetime Sports Network built out to be a pretty good network. And at the end of the day, what were we looking for is revenue on more of a national basis than just trying to fulfill that the local stuff.
And Mike, we had one huge advantage. The Blue Jays were really good and on the verge of winning 2 World Series, and the Maple Leafs were on the verge of getting to the conference finals 2 years in a row. It all went south in '94 with a lockout and a strike, and we had nothing to talk about for a year. And had that happened a couple of years earlier, none of us would be on this podcast today. But and I'm sure you would agree, Allan, like our timing from a Toronto sports perspective could not have been better, because, and I think you said it, Allan, and you're right, people had an insatiable appetite for Toronto sports, for Blue Jays, especially Blue Jays, but Leafs obviously too. People couldn't get enough. Like you could interview anybody about anything, and if there was any tiny connection to the Leafs or the Jays, people couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah, you're right. And from a business point of view, our budget started in September. I mean, it was kind of a weird thing the way they worked at that time, but we had to have everything put to bed. And so when we were 5 to midnight, and everybody immediately, by the way, Michael and Tim was part of this, immediately there was this excitement about what was happening. When Bob went on at 5 o'clock, and then when Dan followed, there was this excitement immediately that this was something that we needed to do. So it moved really fast from that point on to get the rest of this done, and you had to fill out the rest of the dance card. And so, it was a frenetic pace to identify the personnel. Like, we had Bob McCown, we had Dan Shulman. Scott was running a very, very good newsroom at that time that he was going to have to convert to sports by and large, and he had really good people in that room. We also had the Leafs with Joe Bowen at that time, and there was Gord Stellick and Bill Waters and Shaky and all these people. So we felt like we could do it. But I remember getting up one morning going, well, that gets me from like about 5 o'clock to this. We still got to figure out 6 a.m. in the morning all the way through. And I mean, this panic was there constantly with me. Like, how's this all going to work? And that's where Nelson and I, we talked constantly. We talked about it all the time. It's all I ever did was talk about people, talk about possibilities, and talk about what I felt was going to be huge. I always in my heart felt that this thing was going to be big. I didn't know how long it was going to take, but I felt it was the right decision. I went after Nelson and I talked at length about Henny and Hodge. You guys remember the whole Henny and Hodge stuff? Like, I was going to go get Brian Henderson, I was going to get Rick Hodge, and that's going to be our morning show. I think I'd already talked to Dan about, Dan, you're not going to stay in the evening, so we're going to have to move you in the middays, which meant I now had to figure out what to do in evening. And I was interviewing people coming in all the time. But Mike Hogan had come in. I had talked to Steve Simmons by that time. I talked to Damian Cox by that time. I talked to Mary Ormsby by that time, and they all had an interest. We didn't know whether it was all going to pull together, but they all responded with, I'm interested, I'm interested, I'm interested. And so John Ray, who was the market manager at that time, I would meet with him regularly, and in identifying these personnel, he was at the other end going, we can do this. If they're willing, we can pay them this, and so on. So it was all kind of coming together, but it was really this frenetic day-to-day pace, and we had to hit, as Dan noted, we had to hit September, because the Blue Jays were going to be in the playoffs. We have to capitalize on that moment. That's really important. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. If we're going to go, we got to be ready by September.
You know, Al, another name that was very prominent at that time on the on-air side was Ken Daniels, who was backing up Joe Bowen in the morning sports. And I found Ken's presence probably, along with Scott Metcalfe's, probably as helpful to my development as anyone's, because I did the weekend mornings, and in fairly short order, I was backing up the morning shift, and Daniels was kind of my model, and I was kind of working with him as a mentor, and he and I used to hang around a bit. I remember he took me to the that restaurant they had down in Maple Leaf Gardens. I can't remember the name of it, but it was the
Hot Stove Lounge.
Hot Stove Lounge. Yeah, you had to know someone to get in there, and so Ken brought me in there. But what I remember just developing my own skills, which was hard to do because 5-minute sports updates, I had no experience with that. I'd been doing a lot of reporting up to that, but getting the sports update thing down so that they were coherent was a bit of a chore at first, but I couldn't have been in a better environment because Joe Bowen, Ken Daniels, Scott Ferguson, I could model them. Even Dan Shulman was doing sports updates off and on a bit, but the other thing is we tended to go a bit long. I had a little trouble going long at the time. Like I'd eventually cut it off, but the scripts are too long. And I thought, how does Scott and Barb DiGiulio in particular, how do they manage to always come in well under time? So because we used to put our scripts in a little tray, I started studying Metcalfe and DiGiulio's scripts. And I thought, the little light went off. That's how you knock the story down to 2 lines. And then once I incorporated their style in with the others I was kind of modeling, then finally I had enough to draw on to put a coherent update together that came in under time too.
I'm not leaving you guys. My dog had to pee, so we're going mobile for a second here. But let her out and let her back in. Keep going.
Love it, Dan. Now, Scott, I'm going to
turn the camera around so that my dog can see.
She is. Someday.
I'm glad I'm recording this video because this is priceless. Okay, so Scott, actually,
almost like Nelson.
I'm going to play a little audio. We're talking about, I believe the date was September 4th, 1992. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What day of the week was that? Do we know that for sure?
That was a Monday.
Are you sure? Because Labor Day is Monday. I feel like this might have been a Tuesday. Am I out to lunch there?
No, we would have gone on Monday because keep in mind they were in a pennant race, so we would not have taken that Monday off.
Weren't we at the ballpark? I think I was at the ballpark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
we launched from the hotel. Hotel lobby.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
I'm going to play a short clip that says goodbye to the music of your life, CJCL, or whatever it was known as prior to the launch and then the launch. So I'll get your feedback. So let's listen to this.
9:53. Slow, and we thought this was an appropriate final song for 14:30. No more music, and can't do better than this one.
Of China's funny walls, transatlantic halls, a weekend at Niagara when we hardly saw the falls. How lonely it was.
So that gives everybody, especially the kids listening, like this is what it sounded like at 14:30 before you guys go all sports. It's music like this, essentially.
It was a Friday.
A Friday.
It was a Friday. I just looked it up myself.
Okay,
Good
so
job.
there's
I don't think I was there that day. I think I was off.
You took the day off. There's no question you took the day off.
What time was it? What hour did we switch over?
3 p.m.
Yes.
Okay, here's a stinger. I'm going to play a little bit of the launch. So here is how it sounded when you launched.
You're listening to Canada's first all-sports radio station. The Van, 1430.
Skydome in Toronto. This is Sports Radio, the Fan 1430. All Sports Radio is on the air. Greetings, salutations, best wishes. Good afternoon from Toronto. Bob McCown, Dan Shulman, Mike Inglis around the table. And give yourselves a hand here. Thanks a lot for coming down and joining us. We've got a cast of thousands down here. We're going to introduce you to them over the next few hours. This is a memorable day in Canadian radio, not just sports radio, but radio in general, Dan, as we get the unique opportunity to put a brand new radio station on the air, a brand new format, a format that some will be familiar with. It's been in existence for the last 4 or 5 years in the United States, and with great success, certainly in cities like New York and San Diego, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and a few others, but pretty exciting to have our first one here in Canada.
First time in Canada. It's worked in some U.S. markets similar in size to Toronto. We've got a couple of great properties at CJCO. We've got the Blue Jays, of course. We've got the Maple Leafs. We hijacked Mike Inglis from down in Indianapolis. Toronto boy comes back home. We got a lot of people enthused about it. I think we're going to have a good time.
This is, without a doubt, this is probably the premier sports city. I would go as far as saying North America. I mean, it's great for me to come back home here. And when you've got the Jays and you've got the Leafs and you've got all this great interest in everything from college athletics to what have you, even the high school and some of the different events that come into the city. I mean, there's just lots of sports going on, and there's a great interest.
Well, there's hopefully a great interest in what we're going to do. Otherwise, we'll pick out a few of those records that haven't
Get those CDs.
Now, well, what are we going to be doing over the course of the next 40 or 50 years? Now, you're going to be handling the morning show. What do we look for?
Joe Bowen is going to work with me very intricately in the morning, and we'll have Bob Durant with news, Stephanie Smythe doing the traffic, and what we are actually going to do in the morning, some folks might be a little bit surprised because we're not going to come at you with a billion scores in the morning. We're going to do some lifestyle stuff that people are actually interested in besides sports. You know, whether it's your mortgage or the putting. The one thing we always talk about, because Joe Bowen's so up on this right now, is a dump's going in near his house. He wants to know how he can stop this dump from going in.
Yes.
So it's going to be lifestyle stuff you're interested in, stuff that when you go to the water cooler, say, hey, did you hear Bonesy talking about this today, or we're going to also talk about what you talked about the night before. Hey, we got to listen to Bob again and Dan because they had this guy on, that guy on, and what have you. Sports is going to be all weaved in through this whole thing. That, of course, is our main theme. But lifestyle, I guess, is probably the best way to describe it.
Dan, your thoughts on what you're planning on?
Well, I want to mention just before we get to me at noon that Steve Simmons of The Sun and Mary Ormsby of The Star will have a show on from 10 until 12, very issue-oriented. They'll be on Monday to Friday for 2 hours. Once we get to you at noon, we're going to do kind of the same thing that we've done in the evenings for the past 6 months when the format initially changed. Move it up into the midday. Talk to as many ball players, hockey players, coaches, all that kind of stuff as we can. Do some lighter stuff, do some fun stuff, let the fans in on it, and basically just whatever's the hot story of the day we'll do. And then at 3 o'clock, you'll mosey on in.
Mosey on in.
You better mosey on in with a little more of an entrance than that.
Well, I'll be moseying on in with you.
With me for an hour.
So you and I get an hour to yell and scream at each other.
And then I get to go home, and you're so upset you got to work 3 more hours and get it out of your system.
And Hunt will be here at 5 o'clock, as he usually is, and hopefully a little bit earlier today, and we'll chat with him. Well, as we mentioned, a cast of thousands and lots of dignitaries and celebrities with us here. And we have a Major League cake for those of you who are listening on the radio this afternoon. And if you're tootling around downtown Toronto, we invite you to come down. We're in the lobby of the Skydome Hotel at the Skydome, and we've got a little champagne going here. We got a big cake to celebrate the launch of this brand new radio station for you here. 24-hour sports radio. The Fan 1430 is on the air.
I want to hear your thoughts hearing that. I don't know how long it's been since you heard that, but
that gives me shivers. that's amazing. I appreciate you finding that. I don't think I've heard that since maybe the day we did it.
Yeah, I haven't.
There's a great picture of the 3 general managers of the Toronto Kings with Bob and the cake. That is, I've got somewhere, but I'm not at home, so I couldn't go looking through the trash.
We look back on it differently now, Mike, but back then, I think if you had polled 100 people walking down Yonge Street, is this going to succeed? 98 of them would have said, no chance. No chance. How can you talk all day? And again, we like Bob was already Bob, right? But there were a lot of people kind of in my age group who we didn't know what we were doing. And Allan deserves a ton of credit for empowering us to take chances. I think that's the best way I can take. He said, Danny, go do your thing. Just go be you. And I made mistakes, and we all made mistakes. And people like Mary and Steve, they weren't, they were sports writers. Radio was new for them. But Allan, I thought Allan and Scott were a great combination because they came at it from very different areas. And obviously, Scott was more newsroom and sportscasts, and Allan was more talk shows and some other things. But they were a great combo. Allan's the guy who kind of looked at me and he said, you're going to be fine. Just keep doing it. And I'm sure he said it to 50 other people there. And
That's because he didn't know didn't know
what to do. Right. So if it went poorly, he could blame somebody else.
Just go in and do it. And none of this, and I don't want to gloss over this too quickly. Scott was such an integral part of every piece of the operation.
Yeah.
And he was the smart guy. He said, he stayed out of the line of fire, but Scott made very, very few mistakes, unlike Allan and I, who made a ton of them along the way. But Scott was always the voice of reason. After Allan had left and Scott was there to support me, he kept me grounded because I was nuts. And he was that filter for me and for Allan. So, Scott deserves an awful lot of credit for the success of the station.
I thank you for those comments. But what I would want to point out is in the early going, and Allan alluded to this about he and Nelson, they talked about that radio station all the time. They lived and breathed it. They poured their passion into it. And one thing I remember about working at that place that made it joyful was you'd be walking down the hall and Allan and Nelson would be in Allan's office and they'd be howling with laughter. Like that was the feeling of the building. The building was fun and exciting, and it carried over onto the air as well.
It was radio. It's supposed to be fun.
Yeah. Here's a quick Allan story. This isn't 1992. This is probably more like 1994. So I might have even been doing primetime sports by then because Bob went mornings for a while and all that. And I loved basketball, and I would talk a lot of basketball. We had stringers probably isn't even a word anymore, but I would get like college basketball stringers. We were paying them like $10 a hit. I'd get 6 scores from a Syracuse game until I was like, "What are you doing?" Like nobody but you cares. So one time I'm talking basketball, and Allan walks into the studio where I am, and I can still hear the sound of that door as it opens in the studio. And we go to break and he looks at me, he goes, "Stop talking so much basketball. Nobody cares." And then like 2 months, we heard the Raptors are getting an expansion team. And Allan just, with great comedic timing, barges through the door, remembering our conversation from a couple of months earlier, and goes, "Now you can start talking basketball." And that was when the Raptors were coming. So,
and speaking of basketball, you remember that sports ticker we used to have in the newsroom, which was just continually cranking out paper.
Yeah.
And if you didn't check it every 10 minutes, you'd be knee deep in the paper.
Yeah.
We had that programmed not to give us NBA scores. Even in those long 5-minute sports updates we were doing, we were not doing NBA scores. We were making sure to get all the NHL, the MLB, the NFL, the CFL. But then I remember 94 when the announcement came. I remember covering the news conference where the Raptors were formally announced. It was then that we switched that sports ticker to spew out NBA scores. So there was even more paper coming in. And Dan sort of capitalized that there was a sort of anti-NBA feeling in the sports community in Toronto until suddenly out of the blue, the Raptors became a thing. And then we all just dutifully figured out what a point guard was, or at least myself.
Yeah, well.
What a difference between a point guard and a shooting guard was, and I got up to speed.
And yet the majority of the programming on the station still revolved around baseball and hockey.
Yeah.
And, the Raptors, as they got better, because that was a bad basketball team for a very long time. And, remember CFRB gave it up in 1999. And we kind of jumped on it from there. But, sorry.
No, go ahead, Nelson. I was going to say, you remember you and I would talk about this all the time, though. But Scott mentions about having fun, and you and I, to this very day, I love this man to death, and we have so much fun together, and that has never ever changed. And he truly is a wonderful man. But
a lot of the time, we talked about the radio station because he'd drive up to my house at 10 p.m.
Yeah, we would
say, "I'm coming to your house," and I'd say, "No, you're not. I'm locking the door and I'm turning off the lights." And there he'd be knocking at the door, and my darling wife Sue would have prepared an entire meal for him.
There were moments
between everything.
Yeah, there were moments, and for me, a light would go off. A moment was when I heard Dan, And I knew, I went home. I remember thinking how confident I was that we have someone here that we can build around. And I was able to put that aside. I heard Damien and Gord on a side. I was putting them on the weekend for a little while. I phoned John Ray. I was on my way to play hockey. I phoned him and I said, you need to listen. I just found our next show. And they had Pete, whatever his name, Cubby in there. And I got so excited. I remember saying, put that away. Here's the other thing that was exciting for me after we launched, 3 to 4, 3 o'clock, Dan, Barb, and Bob. And that I can remember saying to the three of them, sports radio. That's what we need to do. We need to have fun. Right. We need to have fun. We need to connect with the audience in a different way than just talking sports. But sports is the backdrop at all times. And you three nailed it. You just nailed it. It's the best hour. It was always the best hour on the radio station. It was just fantastic.
Nothing was scripted in that hour ever, because so I did noon to 4, Bob did 3 to 7. We overlapped 3 to 4. So we'd come out of a sportscast at say 3:06 and we're on the air. I saw Bob for the first time at 3:05:58. Like nothing was scripted in that hour. And it went a lot of different directions. I'm not sure in 2024 we could do that. We'd get in some trouble, but it was different. And it was hard for me because, of everybody, I was probably like the most straight-laced guy, the hardcore sports guy. Like that was kind of my rep. But that hour was different, that's for sure.
It was, and Barb made that hour work because she stood up to you two. And Scott, I know maybe Scott can speak to Barb. Barb was incensed. When we were going all sports, there was a point where she came into my office and she said, if you think that I can't do sports, then you are absolutely wrong. If I can do news, she said, anybody can do sports, Allan. Anybody can do freaking sports, for crying out loud. So don't come to me and think you're going to replace me. I can do this. And I was just like, okay.
She was great.
No problem.
She was great.
Barb was, and I remember she first came, I think, into traffic early days, like before sports. Then she got into newscasting. Barb could do anything. She was just brilliant and a fantastic broadcaster. And she could adapt.
We had a consultant. We had a consultant who used to come in, Rick Scott, who was just a terrific guy and really a lot of help in terms of building the station. And he would tell me every year, Art is one of the best sports writers in North America, better than anything he'd heard in the States, better than anything he'd heard in Canada. And every year I would hear that and I'd say, yes, I know. I didn't hire her, somebody else did, but I know.
Well, Barb's strength was, I think, she brought the newsroom experience. She'd written news, which is a tight format, and you've got to hit your marks. So she could translate that skill into writing sports, which someone like myself initially struggled with, basically writing tight. And as I said earlier, I kind of figured out how to do that when I needed to by, just looking at what Barb and Scott Metcalfe were doing with their news background. But Barb was our first evening sports update anchor. She sort of pioneered that skill of doing, banging out a lot of scores on the fly while the games are happening without sounding like a bingo counter, just banging out numbers, because that was a little skill you had to develop as well, how to break up that litany of scores with some color, some substance as to what was going on in the game. And Barb kind of pioneered that because she worked with Dan in the evenings as the update anchor Monday to Friday in that initial 6-month lead up to the all sports launch in September.
Could we do this? Do you mind if we just briefly walk through the opening day lineup? I was there for this. So I was a teenager and I loved sports. And I remember personally being very excited that we were going to have an all sports because, like Dan alluded to earlier, we had a perfect storm. The Jays were World Series contenders and the Leafs were with Gilmore. It was just electric here. I have a picture of Wendell Clark wearing his C to my right here. And it was just that team that went to the Final Four 2 years in a row. And that team in 93, if I remember correctly, wins the first 10 games of the season when the Jays were, wrapping up their back-to-back. So anyone can chime in with any thoughts, but the morning show was Mike Inglis and Joe Bowen. Anyone want to share any thoughts about like recruiting Mike Inglis to come home, as I heard, and then you have your Maple Leaf play-by-play guy by his side? How was that? That was 6 to 9 a.m.
Yeah, that was the toughest day part when we launched because, and Mike on that opening day, called it Lifestyle. And we had a lot of discussion about that. You can't do all sports in the morning. There were two things, Mike, that we had to be very careful of. The first thing was we couldn't have call-in radio, and I was adamant about that. I was adamant that we can't portray a radio station that's just decided to take an evening sports show and put it on all day and have people just call in, because that will fail. What we were trying to do was take people to the story. We were trying to take primetime sports and take it for the rest of the day. That was kind of what we were trying to do. It was really important that we have people like Steve Simmons and Mary Ormsby and people who are connected to the community in a very deep way, the sports community, that could bring the stories and then take us to the stories. But in the morning, we were really struggling. So it was Mike and it was Joe. It was very loud. It didn't work. Personally, it didn't work. It didn't last long. And it created the first of our many hurdles that the station had to get comfortable and to connect. And we had to make changes in the morning.
Al, you remember the tagline that, and in fairness to Allan, I was at the network at the time as all this was going on. So, you know, while we talked about it, I didn't really have a lot of influence in terms of what might happen on the station. But certainly the discussions were, and I think Allan and I both thought, this has to be, you do have to be pure. If you're going to be a sports station, people come into the radio station, you have to deliver sports. And the tagline that some of the marketing geniuses came up with was everything a guy needs to start his day. Well, no, we're a sports radio station, and you weren't giving me everything I needed to start my day, believe me. But that discussion went on for a very long time, and I still think that may have set back that day part longer than it should have.
Yeah, it was, but it was a struggle. It was a struggle in the United States too. Keep in mind that other stations that had flipped to the format were struggling with that day part. The fan didn't work until they made a change, and Don Imus ends up being their morning guy, because they had Jim Lampley in there and other people, and they were struggling. They had Mike and the Mad Dog in the afternoon. Yeah, they had Pete Franklin at one point, but there were issues that how do we do this morning thing, and it took a long time for that to sort of play out. To be frank, I believe it took a generation of listening for it to really work itself out, where younger people who would love the format. There was at one of the schools in Toronto, at the end of our first year on the air, they were asked by their teacher in a class of young kids, what were the two things that were most impressive about what may have happened new in the past year? And one of them was the launch of an all sports station. And that was communicated to me. And I can remember thinking, there's just no way this is not going to be huge. And that at some point, the whole idea of all sports all day will be fine. I mean, the Blue Jays helped us. Let's face it, the morning show was full of Blue Jays talk anyway. But once that, you guys remember, Scott, you certainly will remember, we had a rating of over 700,000. You know, we went from 140 cume to over 700,000. And Billboard magazine named us the radio station of the week or some darn thing. And it was, you know, it was an amazing thing. And of course, our company they were, holy cow, this is going to be magnificent, right? They invested a ton. Sports radio costs an awful lot of money. And they weren't really that eager to spend all this money, but that rating was huge. Well, then the fall was gone and the winter comes, and the Leafs, is Dan right, the Leafs were great, but all of a sudden it was 400,000, and oh, that's not good. And now things really started to get tight, really tight, and there were a lot of changes that happened as a result of it. And a big part of that was the struggle with our morning show.
Okay, so that is 6 to 9 a.m. And then Mary Ormsby and Steve Simmons are 9 to 11 a.m. on launch day.
Two people that had no idea what they were doing that were great. I mean, they were
go ahead. They were a couple of print people and new to radio, but entertaining.
That's a credit. That's what Allan did. He found these people that had credibility, and it didn't matter which medium they were in, and gave them an opportunity to take their skill set and use it to build into something else. Smart people are smart people. And whether they're writers or television broadcasters or radio broadcasters, they will still be smart people.
He's
they'll
bang
figure it
on,
out.
Mike. I mean, that was a, we needed to communicate credibility in a big way. And, I can remember one of the writers from the Star when he asked me what this whole thing was going to be about. And I said, it's kind of the television head as it happens. Remember the show As It Happens, and Bob Holliday at one time at CFTR. Remember he had that show that he would do. It was just news that was just taking you to the story.
Sunday.
Yeah, we're going to take you to the stories. We're going to take you to the stories. Think, I don't know about that. I mean, it's Montreal Jack phoning in, and no, we're going to take you to the stories. And Mary and Steve were fantastic at being able to discuss in depth both teams, all teams, the stories, the history. They knew Toronto, and they knew how to do that. They didn't know how to broadcast, but I didn't care about that. I said, that doesn't matter. We can figure that all out. Don't worry about that. You guys just get on there, open up the mics. As I told Dan, just go down and do your thing. Don't worry about the rest of it. Don't worry about the driving part of it. That's Scott. We got Scott for that, and he'll help you through that. He's a genius at that. But the rest of it was really important that they communicate that credibility, and those two did that.
So Mary Ormsby, Steve Simmons, two great FOTMs, by the way. And that leads me to another pair of FOTMs that just reunited in this basement this past summer. Well, actually, it was probably this past, maybe it was like December, actually. But Damian Cox and Gord Stellick, they took us from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m.
What do you want me to say? I could go on here, but I love those two. Those two were fun. They picked at each other. They got into arguments. They were fun to listen to. So they took, again, credibility, but then created a very entertaining 2 hours to listen to. They could have had a guest if they wanted to. Wasn't necessary, because they were able to create this entertaining 2 hours of really just fun radio to listen to, that the backdrop was sports. But they just connected really quickly.
I think what made that show work was the difference in the personalities, because Gord is kind of this gregarious, outgoing guy who, smiles all the time. Damien, more of a thinker, a little bit more on the, I don't want to say sarcastic side, but was a great columnist, because he could take a position and hang on to it, defend it all the way along. So, and great shows are created by the difference in personalities, not by the similarities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that brings us to Dan Shulman, who's we're lucky enough to have him on the chat for 1430 today. And Barb DiGiulio, they're also FOTMs. Pretend Dan's not here. What can you say about Dan Shulman with Barb DiGiulio? 1 to 4 p.m.
I thought Barb was fantastic.
Can I say one thing?
Of course.
I love Dan to death, and greatest broadcaster that I've ever been around. He said to me after lunch one time, and this was before we ever launched to all sports. We went to lunch, and it was really a discussion about where we were going and that kind of stuff. And he was already getting a lot of praise for the work he was doing on the air. He had already, I think at this point, been approached by ESPN, which, by the way, March 16th or whatever that date was, I knew too that it wasn't going to be long before they were going to be calling, and it wasn't. It surprised me how fast it was, quite frankly, that they called about Dan. But I was telling about a number of people love what he does. They love his talent. They love everything. And we got to the back door at our Holly Street, 40 Holly Street there, and he's opening up the door, and I'm behind him. And he opens up the door after heaping all this praise on me. He turns to me, he goes, "You know what, Allan? The one thing people don't spend enough time thinking about is how hard you have to work to get to that." And I've never forgotten that. I've never, ever forgotten that.
That sounds like me as a dad preaching to my kids for their whole entire lives. Poor kids.
He worked his butt off for everything that he has. And I tell you, as much talent that he has naturally, nothing happens without the hard work he put into it. And I want to make sure you know that. I've always felt that way. And there's a reason why you have won the accolades that you had, is because you work very hard at it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I still do it now. I don't know how to do it any other way.
Okay, again, pretend Dan's not on this Zoom. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dan wasn't here. So anyway, he was also a little goofy too. Sort of like hard to control sometimes. He didn't want to do afternoons. I know that. I don't want to do primetime sports. Bob's moving mornings. I don't want to do primetime. Don't talk to me about
I didn't want to do
primetime.
mornings. I didn't want to do
That's for
mornings.
sure.
I'll tell you that much.
I don't know how many times I tried to get you to go to mornings. Dan wasn't going.
Oh.
But what Dan's, and he's not here, Dan's incredible ability to make the other person look good. And that's, he gave Barb the room to be Barb. The same way when he's doing a baseball broadcast, his focus is creating an opportunity for whoever's sitting in the other seat to be great. And that is that's certainly one of the reasons that if Dan was here, I would tell him that. But as he's not here.
And there's little things where Dan kind of mentored us all without really knowing it, because I remember I was in the newsroom once and Barb DiGiulio asked him, "Hey, Dan, after I do the Blue Jays story, should I go to other American League scores or maybe to the Leaf game?" And I thought, that's an interesting question. Whatever Dan's answer is probably what we're going to do. And to tell the truth, I can't even remember what your answer was, but whatever it was, Barb and I both did it.
Wow. So the question I was going to ask you guys, pretending Dan's not on the Zoom, is Dan Shulman the greatest graduate of the launch of All Sports Radio 1430 The Fan? Like the most successful graduate of that launch day, if you will.
I'd say yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the criteria is, but
yeah.
Oh, the one thing I would add is that there's only one of the original managers who's still working. So I think part of the nod has to go to Allan. He's still employed.
He's still
working.
Yeah.
Allan, before I get back to the lineup here, because I'm very interested to talk about this next host of Primetime Sports. But Allan, where are you working these days?
WGR in Buffalo.
In his living room.
Wow, good for you, man. Okay, good for you. So on the heels, you mentioned that 1 hour overlap where you've got Bob McCowan, you've got Dan Shulman, you've got Barb DiGiulio, but then it's Primetime Sports, and joining Bob McCowan is Jim Shaky Hunt. Let's take a moment and talk about Bobcat. He's not on the Zoom. He's, I know he's made some great progress. He had a stroke. He was very public talking about this, and we hope Bob is recovering well, and we want to get him back A+, but please spend a moment talking about, Bob McCowan and Primetime Sports and Jim Shaky Hunt, 3 to 7 p.m.
Well, it all started. It all started in 1989. If I can go back that far, Lynn Bramson said, Bob McCowan is coming back to town, and I really would like to be able to use him if we can. And I jumped at the chance to add him to our Blue Jays broadcast. And he brought back Talking of Sports at that point, and we expanded that to 6 o'clock as soon as we could. As I said, Mike, there was this demand for more baseball content back then. Anything we could do with baseball, we could certainly sell and monetize it. So we did. And then we moved to the opportunity of Primetime Sports. And talked to Bob at length about going to drive time with it, and we created Primetime Sports. At that point, there was a lot of Bill Waters and Bob at that time, but then Bill moved. I think he was back doing color with Joe, and then that moved to Gord, and then that opened up that time slot in there, and Shaky was obviously
Wilbur went back to the Leafs to be the assistant.
That's what it was. Yeah, he went back to. That's correct. And then we moved. And I can remember Bob, sitting in my office, not knowing in which direction to go. All I knew was he wanted somebody in there. He wasn't going to do it by himself all the time. He was like not a big fan of that. As funny as it is, it's Bob's show, and we all know that without Bob there isn't a show, and that's absolutely true. But he also knew I got to have somebody, a foil in there, somebody to play off of. And Shaky was perfect for that. So we put the two together, and it was magic. In other markets, there were the young, aggressive host and the old writer, the old gumshoe, or whatever you want to call that. And Shaky fit that bill pretty well. So From 3 o'clock on, that was really your prime time, obviously, for that format. And where you have normal talk radio stations where you grow from the mornings, and music stations, you grow from your morning day part. Sports radio, we discovered it was from your afternoon drive. It wasn't for mornings. Your prime time slot was afternoon drive.
Who chose the music for primetime sports? Do you know? Okay, Allan.
I did. Yes.
Love that.
But it was sitting. We sat in the production room there and played a whole bunch of stuff. And
a question
and then we got tired and picked that one.
I think it was. I think it was. I think it was. That one never left. Right. It was one of those where that's okay. I remember somebody wanted to call it "Who's on First," and before we selected primetime, and I was adamant. I go, no, we're going to talk sports in primetime. Let's just call it primetime sports. And then the music was just sitting there and listening to a whole bunch of stuff.
Mike, if I could just jump in for a second on Bob McCown, because I know we're going to go on to other shows, but as Bill Waters used to call him, the Mercurial Bobcat. And he was like herding cats, no question about it. He was his own guy. And what I'd say about Allan and Nelson was they were fantastic in managing Bob McCown. I think Bob respected them. He appreciated that they let him go a little bit. They'd have to, every once in a while, steer him in another direction. And they were successful at that. But they were two of the best. And that helped so much because Bob was such an iconic part of the radio station that you really needed him to be focused and going in the right direction. And I think Allan and Nelson deserve a huge amount of credit for
it was Bob. About trust. Bob trusted us to make sure that he was going to have every opportunity to succeed, and at home. And Allan went through the same thing every day at 3:45. He'd come in my office, whether I was in there or not, and put his feet up on my desk, and he would talk to my chair if I wasn't there. And if I was there, he would talk to me. And my goal every day with Bob was to either have him leave my office either mad at me, happy with me, or laughing. And any one of those three things, he would just go in and the magic would happen. But that was, he needed that to have that trust that we were going to be on his side.
I think. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think for all of us, there was, hey, am I doing okay here? Dan would say that. I mean, whether he'd say it out loud, I know he'd come off the air and go, am I doing okay here? Am I doing okay? I listened all the time, and 99% of the time I was able to say, yeah, you're doing just fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. And Bob was the one we all, he led. Trust me. Nelson and I knew, don't get in his way. Our job is to get out of his way and just to help where we could. That's all. Just help. I still do that today. I don't get in talent's way. I try to help them. I was on the air for a period of time. I understand what that's like. So get out of their way and help them as much as you can. And then every once in a while, you might have to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have gone that direction. I can recall when we went with Primetime Sports, there was that consultant from the Fan that was in town when we went 5 o'clock before we were launched. He's in the office, John Ray, there's me, him, and it's 5 o'clock. I think you were on with Bob at 5, weren't you, Dan? I think that 5 o'clock you were there.
Just that one day, you mean, when we launched?
That first day, I thought you were with him because I can remember he starts talking and we're listening in the office, right? And in my head, we have to be entertaining. This is sports. It's not news. It's not general talk. This is sports. We have to be entertaining. And 5 minutes into it, just like I did with you, I walked into the studio again. And when he's right on the mic, I said, if we're not going to have any fun doing this, we're not going to do it. Forget it. We're not going to do it. You come on. What is this? We need to have fun. Start laugh. I haven't heard you laugh. Has he been on here 10 minutes? I haven't heard a laugh. And I think that resonated with him. Dude, this is prime time. You're Bob McCown. You're the best there is. Let's have some fun. And after that, I mean, we really didn't have to have those types of conversations.
We had a bunch of other ones, but not those.
We always talk contract forever and ever and ever. Amen.
We'd start negotiating the day the signed, and we'd start talking about the next one.
He would leave the office. Yeah, no, I think I like this idea. I think I'm comfortable with this. I think I'm comfortable with this. And so, you might go home and think, I think we got him. I think we got one. And he could, I was thinking, what? I am comfortable, but there's just a couple of things, and then this would go on and on and on and on.
Okay, on that note, so I did ask if anyone had any questions, and I got a bunch, but there's one that's appropriate for this moment from Glenn, who says, I've always wondered about the programming decision to let Bob McCowan do a Toronto morning show from Las Vegas. It never made sense to me having a broadcaster in a foreign country to talk local Toronto sports.
I don't think he did the morning show from Las Vegas, no, he was doing primetime from Las Vegas. So that answers that, Glenn. Thanks for the question. I think, if we look at what we're doing today, we were just ahead of the curve. That's all.
Right.
And you know what? The shows from Vegas worked. It was better when he was here. I remember poor Shaky sitting in that studio all by himself, waiting for where's Bob? And Shaky didn't have fun in that time when Bob was doing the show from Vegas. And I actually went down to Vegas a couple of times, and I'd walk in, and there's Bob, feet up on the desk, cigarette going, and having the time of his life. But it was. I'm not sure it ever hurt us. I'm not sure it helped. I'm not sure it drove more audience because of it, but it was perspective, and it was something he wanted to do, and he's that good.
He's that good. And on that note, I'm going to play an ad that we all kind of remember fondly, and maybe we can find out some details about this.
I know what this is.
So, Ricky, now that you're in Toronto, you're probably right into my morning show on the Fan 1430, aren't you?
Sure am, Bob.
Yeah, I knew that. And you like the way we cover Toronto's sports teams in depth every day, don't you, Ricky?
Sure do, Bob.
So that's why you listen to me, right, Ricky?
No, I listen for weather and traffic. It pops in every 10 minutes or so. Hey, a guy like me got to plan his day.
The Bob McCowan Show. Everything a guy needs to start the day. Weekday mornings on the Fan 1430.
Weather and traffic?
Al?
What do you want me to say? What do you want me to say?
The outtakes were far better than the actual commercial.
Well, I want the audio.
We're on a podcast is watched by many, but I'm going to say this: that was not my best time there. I was never a fan of moving into mornings. I hated every second of it. I was fine with Dan doing prime time. I've said it. Everybody knows I've said it. Fine. I did not enjoy that time in my life. That was a tough time.
But it became fortuitous in a way, because I think Dan moved on to his next gig, and then that created the opportunity to put Bob back on primetime.
As I remember from Dan's first memorable visit to the basement here, he's the only other host of primetime sports. There's only been two.
Yes. Yeah.
I did it for 2 years.
Yeah.
So
and the show never skipped a beat. So
yeah, and loved working with Shaky. Remember him. I mean, just loved working with Shaky. But yeah, and then Bob came back to primetime after I left in February of 95, because I started doing the Jays in 95. So
what you have to remember about the sports radio format is there's a building full of program directors. Everybody knows how to program a sports radio station, and it doesn't matter whether you're an executive out of the corporate boardroom in a business unrelated to media. You're a program director. So we always had lots of help running the station.
Well, that is so true. Even at family gatherings, I would get my earful of everything that needed to be done. And Tim, I like this, but you might want to tell your bosses that they should do this. And if it got too intense, I'd kind of move elsewhere.
There's 3 more people I want to shout out here. Let's start with Mike Hogan, because Mike Hogan, after Bobcat and Shaky, Mike Hogan had 7 to 10 p.m. when you launched 1430 The Fan.
You need somebody to come off the bench. There has to be bench strength. Mike provided bench strength. It was a good place to put him because he can handle any sport really well, very knowledgeable. But if Dan had to take a day off, you could plug Mike in. Felt really confident. He was someone who I felt that, okay, wherever I have a hole in any particular time, I can rely on Mike, but on a day-to-day basis, putting him in on game nights was a perfect spot for him. And I thought he did a really good job in there. Really good job. Solid broadcaster. Really knew his stuff, and he surprised me how much depth he had. And it didn't matter the sport, but he could handle it. He was the one. Dan and Bob, 2 great personalities. Dan. And I say this honestly, I think Dan had a really good grasp of most sports, but Mike Hogan really had a grasp of almost all the stuff. Yeah. There was nothing you could fool him on. He could talk. So that was a good spot for him.
And he also went to high school with members of the Tragically Hip.
I can speak to Mike to a certain extent, because he and I he started, I think our first time he walked in about 10 days after I started in that March of 1992. And we both worked on the weekend sports updates, and we kind of became the 2 senior new hires, I guess. And then we're both hired full-time on salary in the fall. But I was doing the weekend mornings. He would relieve me. And I remember, and that was the routine for a long time, that we'd fill in a lot during the week doing updates. And I did a lot of reporting, which I really enjoyed. And Allan came in one weekend, and somebody that was supposed to host that noon show, the afternoon show, had booked off or wasn't available. So he's got Mike and I there. I'm just finished my morning shift. Mike's relieving me, and he's looking at us both, and he says, here's what I want to do. Tim, I want Mike, I want you to go in and host that show. I think that was Mike's first hosting shift. And Tim, I know you've been working all morning, but just continue. So that's what we did. And I thought, yeah, this is working out perfect, because I didn't want to host. I was really hoping he'd pick Mike, because Dan, quite frankly, was setting the bar a little too high for my liking. And I really was enjoying the reporting, and I was hoping that would eventually evolve into my regular job, which it did, doing the sports updates and a lot of reporting. And so I remember that shift. That was Mike's first hosting shift, and clearly he impressed. And then Al sort of advanced him on to being a regular swing host when we went full time.
Okay, you guys have all been so amazing. This time has been flying here. And here's what we're going to do. Yes, I want to talk about one more time slot, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then I want to read just a few questions, because some good people have some questions. I'm going to read them. And then we'll do a little mop-up. But first, only one of you is in my basement right now. That is Tim Haffey, whose voice we just heard. So Tim, just to make everyone else jealous, large meat lasagna in my freezer from Palma Pasta. You're taking it home with you.
Nice.
Yeah, it's all I've got is the box here, but it's a great
it's in my
box.
freezer, Tim. It's in my freezer. You will leave.
Where it should be.
There's no games here.
Typical radio guy. All I got is the box. What's going on here? Come on.
It's in my freezer, Tim.
There's the free shit.
Yeah, fresh craft beer from Great Lakes Brewery. Okay, so you get the beer. Thank you, Great Lakes, for sending that to Tim. You get the pasta. There's a measuring tape for you from Ridley Funeral Home.
Measuring tape, great. Well,
shout out to Ridley Funeral Home. There's a great podcast. You should
Nelson, leave it alone. Leave it alone.
No, go ahead, Nelson. They got a reservation for you. Just
I would crack open one of these beers, but we had a rule of the fan back then: we couldn't drink on the air. So
not when we went to the Leafs golf tournament. We didn't.
Oh my God.
Some of the best radio I've ever done.
Can you give me that tape? I want that tipsy Dan Shulman tape, if you could dig that up for me. Okay, so just to wrap it up.
No tape.
There's no tape. They burned that tape. Okay, so I want to let everybody know about the Advantaged Investor podcast from Raymond James Canada, hosted by Chris Cooksey. A lot of great insight and educational content for you, the Advantaged Investor. And if you have any old tech, like old electronics, old cables, go to recyclemyelectronics.ca. They'll tell you where to drop it off so it can be properly recycled, because we don't want those chemicals ending up in our landfill. Who wants to tell me about Jim Richards and Norm Rumack? Stormin' Norman Rumack, 10 a.m. 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. on launch day?
I can tell you that Scott sent that release out, which was August 11th, 1992, basically saying we were going to go to all sports. And I can tell you on August 11th in 1992, I had no idea who was going to do 10 o'clock. I was all about, let's just shut the radio off. I had no idea. And I was still interviewing people as producers. And on this very same day, Jim Richards came in and I met with him first. And then Norm Rumack came in second. And after meeting with them, I'm Richards and Rumack. They didn't know it, but I said, this is 10 o'clock. So I went to the two of them. Now, Jim came principally to try to talk, and he was interested in any shift at all. Norm came, hey, if there's anything, I'd love to produce. He was producing some television at that time. I think he was doing some work at maybe CFRB at that time, but he had no idea. What's that, Nelson?
I think W5.
It could have been.
I think he was producing there.
Yeah, he wasn't coming to be a host, but he talked for 20 minutes. He just would not stop talking, and this energy. And I got to have somebody at 10 o'clock. So I brought them back in the next day. This is 10 to 2. You guys want a shot? It's Richards and Rumack. And that's how that started.
Nelson, I remember you telling me when you were in the basement here about that was like the hardest day of your life at the Fan, be it 1430 or 590, the day that you had to let Storm and Norm and Rumack go. Am I remembering?
Yeah. I was lucky enough that I didn't have to let, too many people change professions. But at the time, budgets and body count, excuse me, for lack of a better word, didn't mean to tie it back to the funeral home. But that was a tough day, and he wasn't the only one. And we see all sorts of layoffs and whatnot, but we had to make small changes, and sadly that was Norm got caught up in that, and yeah, that was very tough.
Always remember late nights listening to the Late Night Vampire and hearing the hammer head alerts. This was a lot of fun back in the day.
The Leafs were God's team,
right? Yeah. Wendell Clark, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say Wendell ruled. That was the other one. I could tell you a story about Hammerhead Alert, how that started.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And I'm going to take some credit because my brother and I, when we were younger, I'd say to him, how was the party? And he'd say, a bunch of hammerheads, right? Meaning a bunch of stoners, guys like that. And I was saying to Norm one night, I said, geez, Norm, a lot of your callers sound like real hammerheads tonight. And he ran with it. But no, that was my contribution. The word, he picked up on it, and then he created Hammerhead Alert all on his own, and then the rest is history. But he'll
put t-shirts.
I love the origin stories. Okay, now we're going to burn through some great questions that came in. One from a great FOTM who comes to many a TMLX event. By the way, I know half of you are in the States right now, but if you wanted to come to TMLX 15, it's on June 27 from 6 to 9 p.m. at Great Lakes Brewery in Southern Etobicoke. It would be great to see you there. Great to see you there, Tim. But Brian Gerstein writes in, this episode 1430 is the podcast we all need. Not sure if the timing to launch in 1992 was always the plan to take advantage of the heyday of Toronto sports franchises here, or if it would have happened regardless based on WFAN in New York City, who were first to go 24 hours back in 1987. But regardless, it changed my life completely. My fondest memories of the early years was hearing Jim Shaky Hunt with Bob McCowan, who needed a 15-second delay and not a 7-second one, never knew what he would say, and I was there for it. Is that true? Did Shaky get a 15-second delay?
No. No, we didn't. We had a 7-second delay on virtually everything for protection, but what turned out to be 680 News, CFDR, had gone through the process, as I recall, of exploring the possibility of going all sports, and we beat them to it. It was a year later that 680 went to the all news format, but they were definitely going down that road, I believe. Alan, you may or may not remember that or anything.
I mean, obviously, what was happening in our building, I didn't pay that much attention to maybe what others were doing, but it was out there. If we don't do this, someone else is going to do it, and they're going to go get they were going to go get the Jays. That was probably the biggest reason, is that if we don't do something here, we might lose them. And so I go back to what Steve Simmons wrote, perhaps out of a little bit of desperation.
And I didn't actually know that until Rogers bought the Fan, and I had some discussions with the execs there.
Yeah.
Similarly, I understand, Scott, I think we talked about this when we talked about the 30th anniversary of 680 News, but there was a race there as well, because 640 was going to go all news, and 680 was going to be like for who's going to get in there first, and then 680 won that race.
I think what was happening at the time was it was just AM radio. The music was dying on AM radio. You couldn't make a business because FM was so much better quality. So all the AM radio stations, all of them, had to look at other options. And so absolutely, they were all considering these other options. CJCL was super well situated, having the Jays and the Leafs. So it wasn't an easy decision. And I want to say one thing, Alan, about John Ray. You've mentioned his name a few times. Most people aren't going to know who John Ray was, but he was integral to making this happen. He did the studies, he did the research, and I think he was the guy who said, let's go.
Yeah, he's the one who sold the plan. I mean, he was the one who put it together. I mean, and then empowered the rest of us to go do our jobs. But he was the one who convinced. It was really, and I will tell you, Len Bramson as well.
Right.
Len was always a big believer in it, and I had many conversations with Len along the way. But John was the one that put it all together, every part of it, and he had some tough meetings because sports radio is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
So you might be able to show the potential for revenues, but you couldn't get away from, well, we're going to have to hire 3 people to man 4 hours now when we had one body in there. He had a hard push on that. And telemedia, I think at the time was also struggling with their print assets. So if you look at their portfolio, it wasn't that it was just desperation for an AM radio station in Toronto to do something. There were some other issues with print, with TV Guide and Canadian Living Magazine. So as a company a whole, John had a hard job to be able to say, this is going to cost more, but the other end of it is it's going to be a very profitable enterprise. And I think also he said, maybe it's just to me, what else are we going to do?
Eric writes in and says, I remember exactly where I was when CJCL Oldies turned into the Fan 1430. I was on the.
Does he remember the day? Sorry.
I was on the couch sick. This is Eric speaking. Ultimately turned into pneumonia. Okay, Eric, I hope you recovered. You're still with us. That's good news. Okay. I'm curious if the Blue Jays or Maple Leafs provided statements endorsing the format change to the CRTC.
We didn't need to go to the CRTC.
No.
It's an AM station. FM stations need to get approvals. I don't think we even let the CRTC know.
But they did support it. They absolutely supported it. I mean, I don't think it was anything official, but both teams supported. Are you kidding? Moving to all sports?
Yeah, well, all of a sudden we were doing talk shows from the gondola at Maple Leaf Gardens. We were going down to spring training. We were at the golf tournaments. As we said, we were in the hotel lobby doing stuff. We were everywhere, and that was great too. We haven't talked about that at all. The ability to be remote, to be on site when things were going on. A lot of these decisions were made at the 11th hour if the team won a playoff series, that sort of thing. I thought that was great. Radio is all about intimacy and immediacy, and for us to be where the players were as much as we were, I think was tremendously important too.
And Scott, you'll remember that it was the advent of the brick, the early cell phones, and we utilized that. You know, we're going to take you to the story. We were able to utilize that when Bruce McNall confirmed that he had bought the Toronto Argonauts along with John Candy. Bob got them on the phone in New York in their car. Howard Berger doing his best Howard Berger stuff. Right. And Bob had those two in a car. And I can remember that moment thinking, this is what this is all about. And it was a magic moment, but it was all those brick cell phones back then.
Yeah. And I mean, now cell phones are ubiquitous and nobody even thinks about it. But back then it was a big deal if somebody had a cell phone. And we didn't like paying the bills.
No.
They were expensive.
Mike, I hate to do this. Life is calling me. Duty is calling right now.
Dan, you've been amazing. We'll mop up without you, but thanks for being a part of this.
No, Dan, you got to have finals, Dan. Come on, man.
Final
Your
thought?
shift ends at 5.
Final thoughts.
We are wrapping up. It is in the last 5 minutes here.
Okay, 5 minutes. Let's go. All right.
All right, so last 5 minutes. That's my pledge to Dan Shulman. Okay, so Mike Rogoski says, great topic. I remember the day they made the switch. They filled all sports content for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It seemed like a monumental task at the time. With 2024 eyes, what do you guys see as the legacy of all sports radio in this city?
It was a different time. It was a different world. You know, you couldn't do it now the same way, but you know, I remember as a kid, going back even further, only 2 Blue Jay games a week were on TV, Wednesday night and Sunday afternoon. Like, radio was immense back then, and everybody was in their cars all the time. And again, I think we had great timing with the Leafs and the Jays, and I will still have people, I'm sure you guys do too, I'll still have people come up and talk to me about the Fan days. And I left the Fan 29 years ago. It's insane. And you know, for people in their 20s right now, none of this probably makes sense. But for people in their 50s and 60s, it was a time that none of us will ever forget. It was fun and exciting, and we were winging it. And you know, we swung and missed a few times, but we made pretty good contact too. And I think people will remember it as a tremendous success. I really do. And these 3 guys that we're talking to today are a huge reason for that.
And I'm thinking, okay, the perfect storm of all that great Toronto sports activity in 92, but then we talk about 94, and it's like, so how close does the Fan...
Let's not talk about 94.
Like, how close did it get? Like, was there a moment of like, okay, we're going to go country music now? Like in 1994, you're hanging on by the skin of your teeth, right?
I can tell you that 94 wasn't pretty, but the one change that Telemedia made was they brought in a general manager by the name of Doug Ackhurst. And Doug, it was a hard sell to him because he was a business guy. He was the guy with the black mask, and he was the hatchet guy. But after about 3 or 4 months of him being there, maybe a little bit longer, for argument's sake, 6 months. Allan was not programming at that point. He'd gone back on the air. I was the executive producer. Bob Makowitz Sr. was the program director at the time. It was pretty close to shutting down. And we made one change that we turned into this utility with 2020 updates. And we promoted nothing but 2020 updates, and there's some promotion of the other things, trying to just become a utility and rebuild the audience from there. It wasn't pretty, and it was pretty close to the end, but Doug, I will always admire the way he hung in there and kept the telemedia overlords at bay.
And Nelson, the other major development then was National Sports Radio at night, which we ran for a while, and Allan was the lead host. And initially I was doing the updates on that shift for a good stretch. But
and some nights people heard it.
Yeah, I do remember working one night. It's a funny story, I'll make it quick. But suddenly the producer came into the studio and waved us all off. and said, we have no stations. It was just one of those little quirks because the stations on the network could opt out if they had local programming, Blue Jays or something else.
You're broadcasting to nobody.
Yeah, it's just there was just a little space there where there was nothing. So we all stopped, and then suddenly we were like back on, and then we went back to work.
Okay,
Alan, you have any opinion on that?
I do have yeah, you piece of work. Thanks. But I do know that what Tim may not know to this day is I knew how many stations were on there every night. And and Gord didn't know. It was Gord and I. And at one point I did indicate to him he was off on a tangent and is that going to be okay? And I looked at him and said, don't worry about it, man. There's nobody listening tonight. And he went, what? I said, we don't have one radio station on this thing tonight. Don't worry about it, man.
That's
again, just ahead of our time.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it's like that today, I hear. So, okay. I want to thank you, Tim Haffey, making his Toronto Mike debut. You came all the way here. It's worth it for the pasta and beer. Thanks for doing this, Tim.
Thank you, Mike, and it's great reconnecting with all my old friends from the Wild West days of sports radio in the 90s.
All your old bosses. I'll find out later how you did. Nelson Millman making his triumphant return. It's been too long, Nelson. You're a great FOTM. Thanks for doing this. I know you're a busy man in Florida.
Not so much.
You're a great SOB, Nelson. Great SOB.
Great SOB. Allan Davis, you made your Toronto Mike debut. Thanks for doing this. Good luck in Buffalo there, and it was important to get your perspective here. This made the episode great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Scott, you know this wouldn't happen without Scott Metcalfe. You're like the straw stirring the drink here, buddy. You know what I think of you. Thanks for the gifts that you sent, the Fan 590, the Fan 1430 cards and everything. I'm going to take photos and tweet them. But thank you, Scott, for being a part of this episode.
One of the great things about radio, as Nelson mentioned and as Dan mentioned, is intimacy and immediacy. And you kind of have picked up that mantle, Mike. Because you don't do any editing on your show. It's just live, and it's Wild West, and we love it.
Thank you. Kind words. Thank you so much. And Dan,
if you wouldn't mind doing some editing on this show, I think that would be good.
Dan, I know you're busy and you made time. Gave me a good 90+ minutes here. Thank you so much for being a part of this episode. Again, congrats to your son. That's a huge deal to be the radio voice of the Toronto Blue Jays. And we can't wait to hear you call Blue Jay games again this summer.
Thank you. And great to see you guys. And I'm sure everybody feels the same. You know, we've all, met different people, done different things, been different places, but these will always be some of the fondest memories of my career. It was wall-to-wall fun. At least that's the way I remember it right now. It was wall-to-wall fun, and I wouldn't have been as lucky as I've been to have some of the other opportunities I've had if it weren't for CJCL and for these three guys right here.
I could say, Mike, though, that every other day he was coming down, well, this person just called, I have this opportunity, and this person called, I have this opportunity, and I'm going, it never ended. It never ended.
Hey, yeah, but I didn't badger you about contracts like Bob did. We just talked about opportunities.
No, you left.
Thank you.
Yeah.
and that brings us to the end of our 1,430th show, episode 1430. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky. I'm at Toronto Mike. Much love to all who made this possible. That's Great Lakes Brewery. That's Palma Pasta. That's Recycle My Electronics. That's Raymond James Canada. And that's Ridley Funeral Home. See you all tomorrow. We're going to talk about Big Rude Jake. See you all then.
Nelson's back, I
All right, Dan, you're now a free man. You were awesome.